So, Mr. Maeda and I were the best of friends. The students left on Friday morning, and at 600 hours on Saturday, a busload of happy teachers, groundsmen, and staff set off with Maeda, heading for Kariba via the rather circuitous route that involved Harare and the Ministry of Education. Of course, the paperwork had been rejected as it clearly needed time to be processed. 30 days was the estimate that it was given. The ministry then ordered the bus to return directly to the school. Inside the bus, the passengers had not waited to begin celebrating the start of their long-anticipated trip, and several were already beyond one for the road. On the outskirts of Harare, a hastily convened meeting was held, and all on board signed a document that proposed that neither the ministry nor any of its employees would be subject to any lawsuits if an accident were to occur in the coming week. Maeda seemed satisfied with this and allowed the trip to continue. However, he was not a popular fellow at this point, and as the level of alcohol consumption rose, so did his paranoia. The bus reached Janoi, a large town approximately halfway between Harare and Kariba, and everyone clamored for a relief and refill stop. The bus pulled into the courtyard of the Janoi Hotel, and several passengers went to acquire more cases of beer. It was then that Mr. Maeda suddenly made a dash for the phone. "Help me!" he was heard shouting into the phone. "I am the headmaster of Chindanduma Secondary School, and I have been kidnapped." Of course, the police could not resist turning up to see what was happening. "I am a lion. I can eat wood," roared Maeda as he staggered through the lobby of the Chinoy Hotel. He was not having a wonderful day, and his very public humiliation was something that would lead most ordinary mortals to seriously consider changing professions, if not moving abroad. "Since the bus is without proper insurance, headmaster, it must go back by the same route, and it must go back now." The police inspector was being very polite and restrained, but Maeda was beyond caring, consoling, or even comprehension. "No, I am the headmaster." He leaned forward almost in defiance of the general laws of gravity. "This is my bus. You cannot tell me what I must do." He thumped his chest, straightened, and turned to face his tormentors, a group of teachers, groundsmen, and office staff from Chindanduma, with whom he had spent the last 7 hours in a long-planned vacation to the lakeside resort of Kariba. "I am sorry, headmaster, but I must insist," declared the inspector, and he nodded in the direction of several uniformed policemen. "Then I have to go to Harare to collect my family first," he replied, punctuating each phrase with a chopping motion of his chubby fist. "If that is the way you feel about it, headmaster, I shall impound the bus, and you can walk to Shamba. Do you understand me?" At this point, Peter, the unflappable driver of the ancient school vehicle, stepped forward. He looked down at the policeman with an air of one who has already seen much in his life, and this was just one more situation he could handle. "Comrade," he said in his quiet but firm voice, "I shall drive him back to Shamba. I know the shortest way. We thank you for your assistance." With that, he turned, putting a giant paw over the shoulder of his employer, and steered him straight to the bus. Maggedi, the school bursar, was the first to collapse in a mirthful bundle onto the floor, creating a domino effect, and it was only the presence of several members of the local constabulary that prevented an all-out pile-on from taking place. Gradually, rooms were organized for some, while others went off in search of relatives or a cheaper place to stay. I was at Chindanduma when the bus rolled up the road beside my house just before 11 p.m. that night. Something had gone wrong, as I knew it would. The bus was supposed to be away for at least a week, and yet here it was back at school. I saw Maida alone in the bus, so I waited another day in order to hear what had happened. At least this was a story I was told when the staff began to trickle back to Chindanuma a couple of weeks later. I had decided against going myself, as I was fairly certain that Mr. Maeda would find a way of screwing things up, which he did. Needless to say, the thousands of exercise books sat collecting dust in the staff room and had to be removed before the first meeting. It took several days for the students to recover their precious notes, with the exception of the A-level English classes. It would seem in the rush to produce a certain yearbook, they had forgotten and had failed to hand in a single exercise book to me. The event brought to mind the question about headmasters posed during my first interview in Vancouver. My response had been, I would have to ascertain the situation, Mr. Madawarima. However, I would be a guest in your country and don't speak your language, so I am sure other teachers will notice things much before I do. If I thought it was serious enough, I would hope I would be able to talk to my WUSC supervisor before attempting to contact anyone in the ministry. The answer seemed to satisfy Mr. Madawarima. Little did I know how prophetic these words would prove to be, and that they would come back to haunt me. Every administrator in Africa seems to be connected by marriage or blood to someone in a position of great authority somewhere else. Hence, an outsider's chance of winning any conflict is remote. Number 2. Morliv, the school secretary, lived in the staff barracks at the end of the girls' dormitory, right beside my house. She arrived as a temporary replacement for Comrade Bishi, who was on maternity leave in Harare. I spent a lot of time making phone calls about the school yearbook, and often had to wait in the office for Comrade Maeda to sort things out. Morliv and I got used to spending time together, so it was not surprising that we ended up sharing a pot of tea and talking. Prior to taking this posting, Morliv had been focused on raising her 6 children and catering to her hard-working husband, who was a civil servant. She described him as a humble, kind man who was a good father and provider. Sadly, his colleagues at work had been chiding him about having only one wife. "You are getting older, and soon it will be too late. You will never get yourself a younger woman." Perhaps he won't be able to manage a younger woman anymore. You know what they say, new wine in old bottles. Finally, Morliv told me, he gave in. Even though I did not want him to, I was very angry. Sure, a man can take another wife in our culture, but he must do so with the permission of the first wife. What was I going to do with a baby who was only a few years older than my own daughter? And she was having children too. I already have given him 6 children. Why does he need more? Besides, she is not a good woman. I dislike her. When he married his younger wife, Morliv left and was in the process of divorcing him. She was not a simple girl from the rural areas. She was educated and had lived most of her life in Kwekwe and Harare, and her family was large and supportive. She chose to earn her living herself and had accepted this posting to Chindantuma because she needed to think things through. It was remote and gave her distance from both her children, whom she adored, and the husband who she felt she had betrayed her. What would life be like without his support? After the bus returned from its aborted trip to Kariba, I was sitting at home without any plans for Christmas. It was rather a bleak prospect, and Morliv was leaving shortly to visit her family in Kwekwe. "Why don't you come and spend Christmas with my family?" she asked me one day. This was a very big question. Up to this point, I had never fully cast off the discomfort and security of Western culture. as certainly would be the case if I accepted her offer. She was going to the home area, and we would be sleeping at the family compound. They were aware she was divorcing her husband, and I was a man. I would be meeting her relatives, her children, who ranged in age from 5 to 16, and her peers in the place where she had grown up. More extraordinary, however, uh, here I was, a white man who had belonged to the same colonial race that had patronized and held her people in contempt for the better part of a century. Sometimes when I was in Harare, I would still hear some of them in the city calling poor rural Africans "Kafa" for a bit of fun. Here I was being sought out because I was a nice person, someone that she liked and wanted to get to know more. It was breathtaking. Please come and meet my family and my children, and let us get to be people who care about each other, was what she was offering me, and it was thrilling. That evening I cooked supper for both of us, and we found ourselves looking at each other from different points of longing and loneliness. She was very easy to like, and before long we were planning the trip. A threshold had been crossed, and suddenly I was no longer just an expat teacher. I was a friend. My future stood uncertainly before me, but I could see Africa becoming a significant part of my life and began to look at everything with different eyes. We went to Harare together, but I spent 2 days at the Wusk hostel thinking, fretting, looking for excuses, while she rounded up the children and arranged for me to meet her at the Kwekwe station. She did not wish anyone to know about me in Harare, but she called ahead to her sister and arranged that we spend the first night in town. I arose with the sun and packed up my bags, checking that I had placed my money in a safe place before setting off to the station. I had purchased the ticket the day before, and it was just a question of finding the right coach and seat number in the second-class compartments. While the journey was uneventful, there was a definite buzz of excitement aboard the train. Massive bags and boxes containing clothes, food, bread, and cooking utensils were heading to the farms where the children and grandparents were tending to each other while parents worked in the cities. Small children were unwrapped from the backs of mothers and were breastfed or given delicious things to suck or chew on, including roasted beetles and dried fish and fruit. I was offered chicken piri piri along with the caution, "It is very hot, sir." My lips went numb, but I got the first one down with appreciative laughter and a small cup of clear beer. Christmas is inevitably hot in Zimbabwe, so by late morning we were all dozing, except for those already drunk and others who were playing games of cards. We lurched into Kwekwe at noon, and I stood on the platform looking for Morlev in the blazing noonday sun. I caught sight of a very pretty woman not far from the exit, but looked away because I did not wish to get into trouble. She shouted my name, and suddenly it was not the school secretary who was calling me, but a very attractive middle-class woman who belonged where she was, and it made me feel like a prince. "I wasn't sure you would come," she said as we embraced. It was euphoric and passionate, and we spent the afternoon alone in her sister's house. Her sister and husband returned from work and introductions were made. They were very welcoming, and we enjoyed a meal of chicken and rice, which I learned is traditional welcoming food. We drank wine and talked until it was cool outside, and then we turned in for an early night. The next morning saw 5 of us jammed into a small citron along with bedding, food, and country clothes. The soil around Kwekwe is rich red clay, which is wonderful for farming, but harsh on appearances. So a set of throwaways was common practice. We drove for 40 minutes over fairly well-maintained dirt roads, turned to the left and bumped our way downhill for another few minutes and arrived at a large compound located near a river. There were 3 cinder block houses and a number of huts. This was where the grandparents lived, and as the family had grown up, they built homes and sons married and brought their wives and in time children to share this land. There was a well and generators, and it was modern and all old at the same time. As we decamped from the car, we were swept up by a swarm of children, some of whom looked shyly at me and kept their distance, but the car was emptied of its contents in seconds. There was so much laughter and joy, and my leaden Anglo-Saxon genes wanted to break free and join in. I stood rooted to the spot until the eldest brother came over and greeted me. I found myself trying to remember who I should clap hands to and who I should shake hands with, and it was definitely keep hands off Morliv. Over the next 2 days, I bore witness to my first goat slaughter. While I did not run away and hide, I did decline the offer to assist in the removal of the hide, but accepted a still warm piece of liver. The young boys were well placed, and while the eldest, who wielded the knife, was at least 16, his helpers ranged in age from 7 upwards. The girls, for their part, were busy strangling a few choice chickens and plucking them as they sat around chattering. There were big pots of sadza that were being rhythmically pounded in large wooden pestles carved from limbs of trees, then stirred with several pairs of hands, a spit with a roasting goat, pots bubbling with chicken parts and vegetables, and more rice. I didn't quite fit in. I had no role to play, and while the family members gathered in different houses and shared stories about their families, I was outside. At first I went for walks and explored the fields and orchards, but I remember my mother far to the north and wondered what she would be doing. My cousins were always inviting her to stay, but her memory was failing, and I wondered how much longer it would be before I became a stranger to her. The last time I had seen her, she asked me 6 times consecutively, "What time is it? What time is it?" It was amazing what you can do with a simple round ball of rubber. On my return to the compound, I spotted an old, solid rubber ball. Picked it up. A boy who looked to be about 8 years old, saw me holding it. "Catch!" I said, and threw it to him. Giggles! Before long, there were more little ones, and eventually too many. We played Red Rover, and then an African game that I don't understand the rules of either. I was the Pied Piper. I found myself a role, at least for a short while. Unfortunately, the local water and I didn't get along very well. After a very uncomfortable night, I was pleading to get to town so I could find some Imodium pills. Morliv and her brother-in-law drove me to Quay, and we managed to find a shop that was open. They deposited me in bed, and he drove back to be with the family. I felt very badly at taking Morliv away from her children and relatives, but she stayed and nursed me back to health. Christmas that year had fallen early in the week, so many members of the family had to leave quickly and return to their jobs. I did not get to return to the compound and say my farewells, though Morliv did, and she spent the day out there. When she returned in the evening, she was making plans to collect the children and take them back to Harare so they could celebrate New Year's Day with their father. I made a snap decision, since I was halfway there already, to visit Bulawayo and perhaps even venture to Botswana. We would meet up again at Chindunuma in a few weeks and take things from there.